Awesome. Well, our next and final presentation for the user group meeting this month is our friends, of course, at American Strategies, Goode and Sara Stevenson. Really appreciate their time. I know they're working on a bunch of year-end surveys leading into legislative sessions next year and all sorts of other interesting projects. So thank you both for making time for this today. And they're going to be sharing their insights on what they've learned this year on housing issues through all their survey research around the country. That's hopefully relevant to you all watching. So with that, Joe and Sara, thank you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's Joe Goode at American Strategies. Can you hear me okay, Anthony? I assume yes, I have my full screen up. As Justin said, we kind of wanted to just go over a couple of things with you in terms of some of the things we've been seeing with our research in 2024 and how some of the other RPP clients have used research, polling, and focus groups to kind of get at some of the major issues that you've been facing. And really, as we're looking into 2025, I think a lot of this comes down to almost no matter what issue you're working on, it kind of comes back to housing costs and housing inventory. And so we want to talk a little bit about that and just some of the trends that we're seeing, and then go a little more detail with some focus groups that we did that the Wisconsin Realtors sponsored. This is all Wisconsin Day, on the idea of perhaps creating Yes in My Backyard advocacy groups. So YIMBY groups to kind of counter NIMBY groups. I think it kind of ties everything together that we're seeing. So we wanted to kind of share some of those results with you and maybe get some ideas going in your own head about how to utilize some of this research to address the housing inventory issues in your community. So I think when you think about what we've seen in 2024, and that's kind of the rise of housing costs as a national issue. And I know that might sound a little bit, duh, I knew that. But I think if, those of you like ourselves who have been working on this issue for 10, 15 years, it wasn't really a national issue. Now, coming out of the pandemic, we had interest rates, we saw housing costs really go up, I think you saw that kind of bubbling up from not just being a West Coast and East Coast issue to all sorts of big cities and towns, college towns experiencing problems with housing costs, to where now it doesn't really matter where you poll. Everybody thinks that housing affordability is just a huge issue across the country. And the real evidence of that is you see White House proposals on what to do about housing costs. You saw it in the presidential debates, come up as an issue that both candidates felt they had to address during the presidential campaign. So we've really kind of seen this rise of housing as an issue that's getting a lot more play. And, that's especially true, I think, in the opinion former, what I call the opinion elites, the press. You're really seeing kind of the drilling down, right? Well, of course, housing is expensive, but why is housing expensive? And I feel like I can't pick up the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Vox going online, and I'm seeing some story about someone, writing about why inventory is such a big problem. Jerusalem Demsas has written so many articles for The Atlantic that you can get a handy little book now about all the issues having to do with housing affordability, why we're in this inventory crunch. So I think the elites get it, and we're seeing that at the state level, and a lot of the issues probably that you're dealing with, where state legislatures are getting this feedback from the public. They're coming up with ideas like, zoning reforms at state level, ADUs, making ADUs like a state right. We're seeing that in some states. Of course, on the other side, we're seeing rent control coming up, statewide, state governments considering some type of minimum rent control legislation that I know a lot of you are fighting. So it's all this evidence that housing is really a hot issue right now. But the problem I think that we're facing in the realtor community and the advocacy community is, as far as the public considers this, it's still an affordability issue. They're not really getting this supply-demand problem. I'm going to go a little bit more into that in a second. But in all of our polling, we're just not seeing the public really understanding inventory as an issue. To your general public, this is really just about costs. Why is housing so expensive that I can't buy a home? Why can't my kids buy a home? Why can't I find that, why can't I downsize into an affordable home? So the public still sees this primarily as an affordability issue. And then even though we get all this attention, you all know that when push comes to shove at that local level, at the county level, at the municipal level, we still have this huge NIMBY problem where, the advocacy and the advocates still are in that not in my backyard. Sure, I know housing is a problem, but we don't want this housing issue here for environmental reasons, for traffic reasons. We're going to go into some of the things that we see. So I think that those are the big trends that we've seen in 2024, and I think are really going to apply to a lot of what you're going to have to do in 2025. So let me quantify a little bit of that. We do a poll every year for the Maryland Realtors. Thank you, Lisa May and their team, through their RPP contract. We've been charting housing costs. And you can see kind of here this trend. I mean, even in 2020 in Maryland, 57% felt that the cost to buy a home was too high. The cost to rent was like 60%. But you can see how that went up to 71% saying housing costs were too high in 2022 and up to 76% in 2023. And, we're going to be in the field again here in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure that number is going to be up in the 80% now. So it's not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a college issue. It's not a non-college issue. It's not a young person's issue. It's not an old person's issue. Everybody understands that housing costs, the cost to buy a home, and rental costs are just much too high. And in the Maryland data, and we asked this battery of questions in a lot of our polls, where we ask people who are in the market, what's the biggest obstacle that you see to buying a home? And it really all gets back to this number one here, having a full-time job, but still not making enough to afford a home. That's kind of the crucial thing that we hear in our focus groups, that we see in other research that we do. Hey, I'm doing everything right. I have a job. My wife has a job. We're doing everything. We're saving money, but we still can't get that down payment. And you still see lots of obstacles underneath that. Interest rates, making the cost of loans too expensive, too much debt from college and student loans, having enough money for a down payment, high construction costs, too much credit card debt. But you can see it all gets back to people saying, yes, I went to college, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be able to afford a home, right? So it all gets back to this issue of wages and what folks are making versus what they're seeing when they try to go buy a home on the open market right now. Now, another way that we get at this, and I think a way to think about it and the big barriers that you need to think about that you need to kind of overcome as you're thinking about housing inventory battles in 2025 is kind of what Sarah and I call the affordability availability gap. So I've probably done polls for a lot of you. We do lots of surveys for NAR and other, the renters, the National Apartment Association as well. And we ask a question about how much of a problem is availability of housing in your community. That is the number of houses, condominiums, or apartments that are available to buy or rent. And we have that a very big problem, a fairly big problem, a moderate problem, whole scale. And we also ask how much of a problem is affordability in your community. That is to say, how much it costs to buy or rent a home. I could show you a ton of data on this, but I really just kind of want to show you the averages because this is the battle that we face, I think, in the public. Everybody over here on the left-hand side sees affordability as either a very big problem, that's my really red bar here, or a very big problem. 65% understand that housing affordability in their community, in their county, in their state, whatever jurisdiction I was polling in, it kind of averages out to 65% seeing that as a very big problem. But when I ask that availability question, look what's happens. We only have 43% who say that availability is either a very big problem or a fairly big problem. So there's kind of this 20-point gap overall in our numbers. And we see that go down to 20 points, 25 points, as high as 33 points in some places, where we see this disconnect, that kind of basic supply and demand that we learned back in economics that, well, if there's a shortage of something, then there must be costs going up. But people don't see that housing shortage. All they see are the availability or the affordability problem. Whereas availability, it's a problem, they kind of get it, but it's not on their radar like the way affordability is. So we do a couple of questions that we kind of try and get a little more in detail on that. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for a couple of minutes to kind of talk through some of the types of questions that we ask that can help you in terms of educating elected officials or the press or governmental officials in your community and kind of show you how we can get at these distinctions of what people are seeing. So Sarah, you want to talk through this one?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So another place where we see this gap between folks thinking about the cost of housing being a problem, but not necessarily tying that to housing inventory being a problem is in a series of questions where we ask, is there too little, too much, or about the right amount of this type of housing in your community? When we ask about types of housing in your community, we've got folks who say, yeah, there's too little. They recognize that there's a shortage of some kinds of housing in their community. For example, on this slide, you see at the top of the list, for this community, the type of housing they felt there was not enough of was primarily detached single-family homes with large yards. And then at the bottom of the list, you see apartment buildings, townhouses, detached single-family homes with small yards. And you can see that in some of these cases, the red and the green are almost the same length, just kind of suggesting that's where you get a little bit more of the push and pull between is there too much or is there too little of this specific type of housing. But where we really see that gap between how folks are thinking about affordability versus inventory, Joe, if you could go to the next slide, is if we frame it in terms of the types of people who need housing. Here you can see that the red bars are much bigger because there's more of a recognition that there is too little housing in the community for certain groups of people. So at the top of the list, for example, you have housing for people with low incomes, housing for younger people and those just starting their careers, housing for older people who are looking to downsize, those with moderate incomes, smaller housing options for single and two-person households. These are just some of the types of examples. We ask this question, these two questions, again, all over the country in all types of communities. And what we've learned is that time after time, if you focus on the people who need housing, again, consistent with that cost of housing being the primary problem, folks are much more likely to recognize the issue than if you focus on the inventory side and the type of housing. And for example, a shortage of missing middle housing or a shortage of multifamily housing options or single floor living options, et cetera. So Joe, if you could go to the next slide. We also have a number of concerns that folks have around growth and development when it comes to building more in different types of housing. We ask these kinds of questions to just kind of sort out, cost of housing, yes, a very big problem. But what are some of the things that are holding people back from supporting building more in different types of housing in their communities? And the kinds of themes that we regularly see come up are, again, this disconnect between does supply impact costs. And a lot of folks are fearful that even if there's more and different types of housing built in their communities, that developers or the builders are just going to keep charging high prices for less land and smaller units. So a lot of voters don't necessarily equate building more housing or building different types of housing with bringing down housing costs, which they see as the primary problem. Then also we see often that folks are concerned about the environmental impact of additional housing development. This is expressed in different ways in different types of communities. So in some places that might mean being afraid that additional housing is going to break up the rural character of a community, or that it's going to turn into sprawl that takes up farms and fields and wetlands, or that's going to put an additional strain on natural resources like the water supply out west is something that folks often point to as a concern. Another common theme is that building more in different types of housing will increase traffic congestion. We see this almost everywhere. It doesn't matter how big or small your community is. If you build more in different types of housing, people think that that's going to increase traffic and increase traffic congestion. And then you do have folks who are concerned that allowing different types of housing or building more housing will change the character of the city. So Joe, on the next slide, we've got this other question format that we use sometimes to kind of force a choice between some of these cross pressures that people feel. On the one hand, housing costs are super high, but on the other hand, folks might want to preserve the character of their community or be concerned about water supply or be concerned about traffic congestion. And so we oftentimes ask a kind of paired question that we can frame in different ways for different communities, but this really gets at the heart of the matter. in terms of how people feel about increasing inventory to bring down costs versus some of the concerns that they have around growth and development.
Well, what I thought might make sense to do, and with Wisconsin's permission, we wanted to share the results of some focus groups that we did for them earlier this year, where we all know how activists and loud the NIMBY people can be. The Wisconsin folks were wondering, well, what would it take to create a YIMBY group, perhaps using data, using statistics, to get people motivated to contact their elected officials or government, local government on, yes, we need more housing. So we put together a set of focus groups in Wisconsin. We did the folks we thought would be looking for housing. They were Milwaukee area residents concerned about housing affordability and availability. We talked to some NIMBY voters in the Janesville area, people who kind of wanted to limit the construction of new housing in Janesville because that's where there's been a lot of construction going on. And then we also talked to some other potential YIMBY voters who we thought might be YIMBY voters, folks who live in Dane County in the Madison area, where housing costs have really exploded and they're looking to buy or sell or downsize. And we did these 3 focus groups and wanted to kind of get that qualitative, wanted to hear how folks talked about it. So when we went into the room, we started asking about, hey, how do you feel about housing costs? It was a very animated discussion. Everybody had a story to tell, either a personal story to tell about themselves, the difficulty they were having finding housing or getting into that first house, or their kids wanting to live in the area, living close to family, couldn't afford a home. It was a very personal issue, really replicating what we see with the quantitative numbers in our polls. This qualitative information really kind of filled out just how personal the housing issue is to people. When we asked them, hey, what's the problem here? Why is housing so expensive? We were hoping we might hear, well, all these people are stopping, housing from being constructed. Or at least we thought that might be part of the conversation. It really wasn't. What people talked about were inflation, interest rates, supply chain, cost of labor, all sorts of things came up, and they kind of understood that there's a multivariate, multifaceted reasons for why housing's so expensive. But they really didn't talk about NIMBY at all in this section where, they're, and then people make it tough to build. But they did have a pretty good awareness of why everything else was being so expensive. So when I pushed them on this idea that hey, we can't build. It's hard to build because of NIMBY people, or maybe you're not seeing enough housing construction. Well, they really just stayed focused on cost because they saw lots of construction going on around them. But they would talk, to Sarah's point, about, there's $600,000 2-bedroom condominiums here. There's $850,000 row houses. They're not the kind of housing that I can afford or that my family can afford. It's expensive housing that's being built. It's smaller housing than what I want. And, I couldn't afford it anyway, even if I wanted to. So there's really some of that pushback here that they didn't see availability as the issue. They saw affordability as the issue. And when we really tried to push them on the NIMBY thing, they kind of said, I understand that. I know that happens, but I don't think that's the reason why we don't see more housing being built or why affordable housing isn't being built. So our next step was to try and really push this idea of, well, would you contact your official? We threw some statistics at them about how much housing is needed in Wisconsin, how much shortage there is between demand and supply. And, it all made sense to them. And this idea of yes in my backyard activism was appealing, especially people who were in the market. But it was kind of a lukewarm reaction, to be honest. It was like, well, it couldn't hurt, right? I mean, I'd be willing to make this phone call. And the more we kind of showed them advocacy materials, they got a little more interested in it. But initially it was kind of does my voice really make a difference? We kind of fell into that cynicism about government. But the more we showed them, the more materials we kind of gave them, the more information we gave them, we did see a lot more motivation, people kind of willing maybe to contact their local officials. And that was especially true of renters who are looking to buy. And that was especially true of parents with children or family members, people in the market. So if you're kind of looking for who's your low-hanging fruit for YIMBY activism, it's going to be people who you would expect it to be. It's people who are in the market. It might be parents whose kids are trying to buy, or it might be their kids who are trying to buy. In Wisconsin, especially in Dane County, there was a very partisan dimension to it as well, where you had a lot of these kind of Democrats under 50 who not only wanted more housing for themselves, but they also kind of felt housing was a right and it just needed to be more housing available to kind of address homelessness and unequal housing. But I think for most folks, it's those first two groups that are going to be the most likely advocates for you in terms of doing that YIMBY messaging. As Sara said earlier, in almost any outreach campaign that I do, the most effective messages are going to be the ones that hit home in that kind of personal way, either to them personally or a scenario that they can say, yeah, I understand that because it is affecting me. So the two messages that we had best were too many working Wisconsin families are being shut out of home ownership because there are not enough affordable homes available. These are often two-income households, but there are not enough starter homes on the market. I can't tell you how many hands went up and said, that's me, or that's my kid, right? It really kind of hit home, made a lot of sense to people. Another really strong message is kind of a play on workforce housing in a way, but kind of tying it back to the services that people receive. So we talked about the lack of housing in Wisconsin is taking a toll on healthcare, education, and childcare. For example, medical technicians can't afford affordable housing, making it harder for hospital and doctors' offices to provide care. Teachers and daycare workers can't afford housing near where they work, resulting in larger class sizes and limited and expensive daycare operations. So again, we were trying to put a human face on it, but also a face that people could understand how lack of housing affects their ability to get medical care, their ability to get childcare, their ability to have teachers live and work in their community. So those are kind of two examples of the type of messaging that I think works when you think about inventory and some of the challenges that I suspect a lot of you are going to be facing in 2025. So we came out of these focus groups saying, yeah, there's potential for this yes in my backyard activism. It's driven really by housing costs. That's what motivates people. They're not wanting to, fight the NIMBYs. It's really more about what can I do to do something about housing costs. But it's really an education task that has to happen out there for folks. People just aren't making that connection between lack of housing inventory and affordable housing. We don't think that YIMBY activism is going to arise organically. Somebody's going to have to take the lead on that. There's either going to have to be, kind of to Robert's point earlier, make maybe this separate C3 or C4 organization, do it as the realtors, depending on your community. But somebody's going to have to kind of organize and make this YIMBY activism happen. It's unlikely that it would happen organically. But once you get out there with materials, once you kind of do some of that education and kind of make this more into a personal issue, we think that there is potential for running campaigns that would get people motivated to contact their local officials about the need for more housing and try to kind of counter some of that YIMBY activism. So again, we always encourage you to reach out on us. NAR has lots of opportunities for funding research. I think you guys all understand how you can use it. It's great, even if you want to just get a seat at the table, working with local governments. Most local governments can't do this kind of research. They're not willing to spend that kind of money. So there's a whole smart growth program at NAR that we do a lot, where folks are just saying, hey, let's help inform a comprehensive plan. Here's a poll that we can bring to the table that can kind of quantify the way people view the housing shortage, some of those questions that Stevie talked about earlier. Just informing the public debate, doing a poll is a great way to kind of quantify the problem. Great ways you can say, look, X% say housing affordability is a big problem in our community. Y% say it's, rental costs are too high. Really putting some of those things out there is a simple way for local media to kind of latch on and get your message out there a little bit better. Or just understanding your operating environment. We haven't shown it here, but obviously we can test certain things, ADUs, rent control, all sorts of things, just to see what people are open to in your community, what type of solutions might work best, which solutions might get pushed back on. Again, understanding what voters are open to is a big part of this, as well as message testing can happen in all your survey research. So I hope that helps a little bit. We'll open it up to questions or discussions, or feel free to send Sara a message. I'm at joegood@amstrat.com. Sarah's at sarahstevenson@amstrat.com. And we will turn it back over to you, Justin or Anthony, and answer any questions.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sarah. That was excellent as usual. Would expect nothing less from both of you. Waiting to see if we have any questions that pop up here in the YouTube. No questions so far. So people know where to reach you if they do have some follow-up questions or want to do something similar in their areas. And again, we will be sending out links to the recordings of these presentations later on if people want to share those with others or whatnot. So with that, I think we are ready to wrap up. If there's no waiting to see if any last minute questions pop in, but otherwise, I think we're ready to wrap up. We appreciate everyone's time who's been watching out there, and appreciate our opportunity at Real Strategies and American Strategies, excuse me, to get to work with so many great people around the country. Happy holidays to everyone, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help you with anything. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this month's user group meeting. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Happy holidays.